today's class reviewing a little bit of what we did last week. We laid the groundwork of how to lay out a simple crop plan for a 3-bed system, which is easily scalable. And then we're going to go a little bit further today, and I'm going to talk about how to plan your seed starting, how to plan various crops getting into the ground, and how I denote all of that in my crop plan. That way we can just be kind of more ahead of schedule. Again, crop planning is so important because we get so busy and there's so many moving pieces in our lives. The more that we have planned out, the easier that map is going to be to follow kind of for success. So, as Greg was saying kind of at the top of the hour, I try to get my seed order. I usually will fill my cart over the holiday season. I typically have a little bit of time when we're sitting around with family, and we talk a lot of gardening in the family, so it's kind of nice to do what varieties have done well for family members. And then I will try to order it just after the first of the year, and that really allows me to kind of get to the front of the line. I did not do that this year, and I put my seed order in about January 10th, and I was finding a lot of things already sold out. So please heed Greg's warning there and try to get on top of seed ordering if you haven't. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into sharing the screen, and I am going to go over a quick review here. So I'm going to pull the screen from you guys. Oh, my dog is going crazy. She wants to be part of this here. All right. So try to zoom in on this just so we can see what's happening. So what we've done is we have laid out a single 4x8 garden bed. This is the garden bed through space. So imagine this as a 2-foot by 4-foot section. We have 4 of those equaling 8 feet. This way is gardening through time. So this would be carrots are in half of my bed starting on the 3rd week of February, and that's when I would seed my carrots. And then this is the length of time that they're in the bed. So my carrots should be out by May 15th. And as you can see, carrots love the cold, as do radishes. They don't mind being cold at all. So I can put those before our frost date. Our frost intolerant plants such as tomatoes, eggplants, corn, squash, all of those things have to go in afterward. So what you don't see here is I want to put my tomatoes in on May 15th. That's when we get the last frost in our area. So take a look at what your frost date is, and that's kind of a nice guiding point in the map. So if I want my tomatoes to go in May 15th, I certainly don't want my tomatoes to be seeded on May 15th. I have to make sure I'm putting in nice, large, healthy starts. So what I'll do is, how I kind of work mine is I'll start at May 15th. I know I'm going to transplant them. Oh. So I always denote in my crop plan TP for transplant tomatoes. So I know that I'm going to be transplanting them on this date. I know that I want my tomatoes to be about just almost 2 months old when I put them in the ground. So what I'll do is yes.
Hey, Joshua, could you possibly blow that up a little bit bigger, please? It's tough to read.
Is that a little better?
Fantastic.
Yes. Sorry about that, guys. So what I'll want to do is plant them, depending on my current greenhouse conditions, a little bit earlier. I want to go about that 6 to 8 week mark. So I'm going to count backwards 6 to 8 weeks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I'll put them on 8 because it's going to take them a week to germinate, and then they'll have 7 weeks to grow in my greenhouse. So then I will put seed tomatoes on the same row that my tomatoes are in. So, and I want to put that on all of them that are going to have tomatoes. So now, this is always the problem here. Sometimes Excel doesn't want it to be easy. I like to keep the colors nice and similar. So now with a quick look at my crop plan, I know the last week of March, I'm going to have to get my tomatoes seeded. They'll grow inside for a few months, and then they'll be ready for that transplant date. So that's a really powerful thing. Same thing with peppers. Peppers, I usually let go a little bit longer. I want them an extra week. Peppers kind of grow slowly, so I will put seed peppers here. Sometimes you got to mess with your spacing a little bit to allow all the words to be properly spaced. And chard. Now chard, I only need to be about a month old, and you'll kind of get the hang of these as you've grown them, about how long they take in the greenhouse. So chard, I like it to be 4 weeks old. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll go over to the 5th week, and this is kind of the germination period here for chard. So I'll actually start denoting everything seeding on here on anything that's transplanted. So I would have marked these all transplant, just so I keep everything nice and simple on my sheet. It stays nice and clean. Everything's very consistent. And then we're going to go into how I would denote whether or not something is direct seeded. About the dead time here. Just want to keep everything nice and organized. All right. So on direct seeded items, such as carrots, I'll actually just denote that with a DS, and that tells me that these are direct seeded. So I don't have to worry about a transplant time or how long they grow in the greenhouse. So it keeps it nice and easy for me. Kale, I don't like to direct seed kale. I want it to be about a month old as well. So I know that I need to seed my kale over here. So that I think is a very useful tool, and it helps you get, not only now do you have your transplant dates and when you need to have them ready for your garden, but you also now know when you have your seed dates. So that's taken away 2 of the major scheduling concerns with this. Now, on this last bed, so if we kind of just zoom out here, I know in this bed, starting on the 3rd week of February, I'm going to have half of a bed of carrots. I'm going to direct seed those. I have half a bed of radishes. Both of those are going to grow all the way to the frost date. I'll be able to start harvesting them in this window here, and I need to have the bed cleared because it's time to get those tomatoes in. I knew back in the last week of March that I needed to get my tomatoes seeded and start caring for those in the greenhouse. What I will typically do if I'm purchasing plants, I will just denote purchase transplant here. And this allows me to know that I need to go out and go shopping this week, purchase my transplants. The reason I like to purchase them a week ahead of time is it allows me to start hardening things off. So a lot of times if we purchase plants from a greenhouse, they've been in a nice cushy life. I like to put them in the shade for a week and let them really acclimate to their outdoor environments before I transplant them. So getting them a little bit earlier certainly helps. So you can just denote purchase that way. And I will go through, and anything that I'm purchasing, I will denote that way. And I highly recommend, if this is your first year gardening, go ahead and buy starts and maybe try to start one thing, maybe two things from seed, and buy the rest of the starts if you can find them. And the reason I recommend this is seed starting is it's very approachable, but it takes a little bit of time and practice to get good at. That way we ensure that we're having success. If if your greenhouse space or whatever you're using to start your starts gets too cold or too hot one night, you might have some failures, and I don't want the entire garden to be lost. So I always recommend newcomers to do mostly purchase transplants, and then try your hand at starting some seeds, and then every year build on what you're doing. After you get a little better, then you can start seeding and seeding more crops. I like to call this start small and master all. So what that means is start with a small group of things and master them all. And once you've mastered them all, then you can kind of move on and start expanding that skill set. I really recommend the same thing for first-year gardeners in general of what you grow in your garden. So what I like to do is recommend that they find the 4 crops that they love to eat the most, or the 4 crops that will do best in their environment that they have, their individual garden environment, and start with just 4 crops in your first garden. If 4 seems a little too high, that's fine. Start with 2. But starting small and learning kind of the nuances of growing that crop, getting just the system of gardening down, how much time you're going to devote each week, that all really is beneficial, and get the first year garden kind of master all those crops that you grew that year, and then add on 2 more crops the next year. And as we move forward, we can make things more and more and more complex. So I really advocate.
Hey, Joshua.
Yes.
So everybody, I told Joshua I was going to put him on the spot tonight and actually have him suggest those crops that you should start with. Do you have a couple of recommendations on maybe that 2 or 4 crops that they should choose?
So I think if we're talking about starting from seed, I think cucurbits are amazing to start from seed. They germinate very easily. They germinate at a high rate. So germination rate for most cucurbits is over 90, while with tomatoes, you're down in the 75 to 80%. So your rate of success is much easier. So
could you let everybody know
I just realized I might not have been. So cucurbits are your cucumbers, your squash, your zucchinis, melons, and I think that's about the list there. Those plants grow very rapidly, so it's not a 2-month time that you're responsible for them inside your greenhouse, keeping a very kind of niche temperature for them. They're typically ready to set out within 3 weeks at the longest. So I think those are really good candidates to start seeding with. I also think starting with, if you've never grown tomatoes, start with a tomato. I think it's the most rewarding thing. I think it's probably a lot of people's favorite. And that, again, the plants get so big, they look so beautiful. It's very rewarding as a gardener to grow a successful tomato crop. What I will say, though, is curb back those tomatoes your first year. Maybe grow 1 or 2 tomato plants. Keep it nice and simple, because there's a lot of work to tomatoes. The work isn't hard, but it's good to, again, figure out that's your specific tomato growing system before you try to plant 4 beds worth of tomatoes, because you'll get underwater really quickly. It's easy to get behind in tomato growing. Another one I like would be peppers. So I don't recommend, if you're a beginner, to start with seeds on peppers, because they do grow so slowly. If you're going to start with tomatoes and peppers, I recommend buying those the first year, and getting a nice, rigorous, healthy plant and starting. The reason I like peppers is because they're drought tolerant. That's typically the largest problem I see in the garden, is people underwatering their first few years. and the timing of their watering. So peppers are really resilient with that. They also don't have a lot of pests. So I really think peppers is a good way to be successful. And lastly, I will give you kale. I like to grow kale for a few different reasons. Kale keeps you in the rhythm of your garden. So you can plant kale at the very beginning of the season. You can watch it flourish while it's cool, and then you watch the production kind of wane as it gets really hot in the summer. And having that indicator plant in your garden to show when the garden's really producing well, when it slows down. And then with kale, you actually have the opportunity to keep that plant growing through the summer and let it go back into winter, like fall mode, where it'll go back into really good production. Or you can pull that plant and plant another kale behind it and have a fall producing kale. So I think that really shows the rhythm of what the gardening season is, because we're really fast growing in the beginning and then it slows down. It gets really hot. Everything kind of starts crawling, and then we get back into fall and it ramps back up again. And that's a lot what I see a lot of first time and new gardeners not anticipating. So I think that really helps you just visualize that, as well as kale gives you the opportunity to see a lot of different pests. There are a lot of different pests that like to eat kale. So I feel like you can start to get to know your pests without, if you have a few kale plants and they end up getting pesty, don't worry about it. Treat that as a learning curve. We're all learning while we're gardening. So I think kale is a really good opportunity because you have cabbage loper at the beginning. You'll have some harlequin beetle in the mid to late season. Some people might be dealing with flea beetle with them. So it really helps you identify pests in your garden and just get to know your garden ecosystem a little better. So I think that's a pretty extensive list of what I recommend for newcomers, both seeding and starting with transplantable plants.
So that's interesting for me because I gave myself the same challenge, and I was kind of curious how me and Josh might line up on this. I'm going to throw mine out, and then Josh, I want you to react to this. I want you to react to what I've got. I thought beans would be a good starting plant because you could explore a pole bean and a bush bean, and look about the extended harvest of a pole bean, plus also learning a little bit about growing vertically. And then you've got that condensed harvest around a bush bean. And then for that same sort of garden, I can't remember, you used a great phrase, but sort of that metric that you talked about with kale, learning the flow of your garden. I thought lettuce would be good for that. You could learn about succession planting throughout the season to keep that harvest coming. Maybe some row cover in the middle of the summer for sun protection, to keep it a little bit cool. So you get an opportunity to kind of explore a few different lessons with your lettuce. And then I chose tomatoes because everybody has to grow a tomato, right? That has to happen. But you've got the opportunity to grow, an indeterminate tomato that's going to keep growing and put it on a trellis, a determinate tomato. You can learn the difference between those two and, again, have that condensed harvest. And you can also learn about, the ongoing maintenance of your tomato plant with pruning and suckering. And it's a little bit more in-depth. I love your suggestion of one or two to take really good care of those as opposed to trying to grow enough for, pasta sauce on that first year. And
so,
there you go. Same similar concept.
And beans and lettuce were this close to making my list. I think beans is a wonderful, especially like you said, the pole beans. It's great because they have such a seasonal longevity. They'll just go until the frost comes. So that really, it teaches you a few different lessons, and they don't typically have a lot of pests either. Not a lot of disease in this area. So I think those are great lists. Yeah, I was very close to putting beans on my list. So I think great minds are thinking alike here. I like the fact that you mentioned indeterminate tomatoes, something that I forgot to mention, versus determinate tomatoes. I think determinate tomatoes for a first-year tomato gardener is a wonderful thing. They're less work, they're less trellising, less suckering, but you kind of get, again, the rhythms of what your tomato goes through. The only downfall to that is with ease of care, you will get a condensed harvest. They put on hard, but they're very quick. You get 1 or 2 big harvests, and then they're basically done. But what that does allows for a fall crop. So what you're losing in tomato production, you're gaining in, let's say, a fall carrot production or a fall beets production. So don't think that you're completely losing the garden. So I have one more thing that I wanted to show on this shared screen here. So I'm going to pop back over, and then I'm going to come back to you. All right. So one thing that we haven't addressed is succession cropping. We sort of did it here. You can see that I have snap peas in half of this garden bed in the spring because they love the cool weather. And then when it gets hot, it's time to put something that loves the heat in there with my peppers. And then, well, actually, I guess we'll go with the chard here. And then in a separate spot, I put snap peas. So that's snap peas being grown in the spring and the fall with something in between them. So that is the basic idea of succession cropping. And where succession cropping for me becomes really important are squashes and cucumbers. So I get asked a lot, how do I grow successful cucumber crops and squash crops? So we're going to talk a little bit about this. So we're going to do 1 cucumber and we're going to do 1 squash in this last half of the garden bed. So I know I automatically start here because I know I cannot plant these before the frost date. They are not frost tolerant. I will typically transplant mine, and the reason I transplant mine, you can easily direct seed these. They do really well when you direct seed them, but I would have to wait to direct seed them. The earliest I could direct seed them is maybe the week before the frost date. So that means if I have to wait 55 days for my first squash, that means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, let's hold on, 7, 8. We'll call it 60 days here. So that means I'm not getting my first crop until mid-July. But if I transplant them and I seed my cucumber here indoors, then I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I will get my cucumbers much, much earlier in the year. So we're going to make this a color here. That looks like a cucumbery color. And so squash is going to be the same way. I'm going to seed my squash indoors, start them in little pots, and I will then have squash.
Jeff, could you go a little bit?
Yes. All right. So this is my half of a bed. 1/4 of it is going to be cucumbers. 1/4 of it's going to be squash. I want them to fruit as early as possible. So I start these seeds before the frost date inside, and then I will transplant them right there on that frost date. But here is the kicker, is with squash, we deal with something called the squash vine borer, and with cucumber as well. What will happen is you'll get these kind of, they almost look like they're droughted plants with really weepy leaves. They stop kind of producing, and what's happened is an adult vine borer has burrowed in the base of your squash or your cucumber, and it's eating all of the conductive material. Well, those guys stop feeding or stop laying their eggs about June 25th. So right here we have June 25th. So what they're going to do is they're going to lay their eggs in your early squash. That is inevitable. I'll usually lose anywhere from 25 to 50%. So what I will do is on this day in my greenhouse, I will seed more cucumbers, and I will seed more squash 1 week after I plant both of them. So we transplanted them into the field on the second week of May, and on the third week of May, I'm going to seed more. I'm going to go over my 4 weeks, and then I will be pulling up these squash, anything that's dead or anything that's been hit by this squash beetle that doesn't look really nice. I will go ahead and transplant these cucumbers and squash, and I'll do another succession of them. And what that allows me to do is have healthy, young, virile plants for the entirety of the season. So I will go over, these are already 4 weeks old, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'll be able to start harvesting them. We're going to do this the same color. That nice dark green. This is, since it's the same crop, I'll label it as the same color. Oops, so shade darker here. And then, and you can actually do this one more time, but typically what I found is on this second succession of cucumber and squash, they are going to go out in the field after that June 25th date. If you look down, is when they'll go in the field, and you shouldn't have any more trouble with the squash vine borer, and you should get long sustaining crops. Now with these two, while we're on the subject of them, I also like to let them trellis. So my cucumbers, I'll lay a trellis out. I want them growing up. Otherwise, they take a lot of vertical or horizontal space in my garden. So that's the only way that I can grow 4 or 5 cucumbers in a quarter of a bed, is to allow them to grow up a little fence. I love to use 4x4 cattle panel is my long-term choice, but you can build something, any sort of trellis. Now your summer squashes, they're not going to run per se, but they will elongate, I guess is the best word for it. I'm going to go back into screen mode because I'd like to talk with my hands here. So the trellis, the cucumbers will grow right up the trellis, and it's actually very advantageous to grow them vertically. They don't like their leaves to be wet, so getting them off the ground and allowing that good air circulation is very beneficial for keeping downy and powdery mildew at bay. So you're getting a few different benefits there. You are not using the precious horizontal space in your garden. You're growing upward instead of outward. And then you're getting that disease and pest benefit. Now with the summer squash, so they get to be big, and what they'll do is you'll see that it'll start to run one way. So if your seed is here, it might run a total of maybe 2 or 3 feet. So make sure that you're not cramming your squash in. I think 2 squash for a quarter of a bed is more than enough. And I will say that they tend to want to grow at other plants for some odd reason. But what I would do is if your squash plant is starting to grow into your tomato or your pepper, you can simply pick the plant up and rotate it very gently and move it. That way it's not growing into another space. Another beautiful thing is you can actually let squash run into your yard because the root system is going to stay in the bed, and then it's just the shoot and the vine system that kind of crawls out a little bit. So I've certainly had squash laying out of my raised beds at home. And that's just another way for me to utilize more actual bed space and just take a little bit of my grass and it'll be covered in squash plants. Now, when we're talking about winter squash, your butternuts, your spaghetti, your acorn, those are going to be running squash, much like the cucumber. So again, I grow those vertically. I've grown vertical pumpkins. I've grown vertical watermelons. Anything that's in the cucurb family that runs, you can grow it vertically. I know we see these large pumpkins and these large watermelons, and we think to ourselves that there's no way that'll hold. It will certainly hold. Very rarely, until it's ready, do I have something fall to the ground. We had a downtown garden, and a pumpkin climbed up a building, and there was a pumpkin maybe 25 feet in the air for the entirety of the season. Now, we didn't get that pumpkin until winter because we didn't have access to it, but it finally came down in the winter. But they're stronger than you think, so we can certainly grow those vertically. And then one last thing is with your squash and your cucumbers, you have male and female flowers. So if you're picking squash flowers, make sure you are learning the difference between what a male and a female flower is, because we only want to pick the male flowers because the female flowers will be the fruit. So we pick all of our female flowers off, we won't get any fruit. And for cucumbers, oftentimes I don't see cucumbers pollinating very well if there's not enough water. So if you're not getting a lot of cucumber pollination, you're not seeing cucumbers growing, I would try to add in a little bit more water to your system. What happens is when we trellis these crops, we've now opened up the ground. We've raised the crops off the ground, and that soil dries out much faster. So since we're doing that, we need to make sure that we're putting the water back. That's the cucumber growing on the ground. It's evolved to do that, to keep its growing area nice and moist. That way it has all of the water we need, because that's a lot of water content in those cucumbers. So pollination takes a lot of water, and successful pollination takes a lot of water. So just make sure you're watering them. Always water the soil and not the plant. That way, again, they like to keep their ground moist, but they don't like to be moist themselves. So it's a small little difference there. So I'll open it up to questions.
So Josh, we've got quite a few. I'm actually going to start with the last one first because I think it's pretty relevant here. But so when you're talking about these beds on your plan, can you remind us what size bed you're considering?
Yeah, so I am doing a 4x8 bed, and the only reason I'm just talking about a 4x8 bed is that's typically what I see. I feel like that's typically what, as home gardeners, what we build. But don't think that you need to stick to that dimension. Stick to the dimension that makes the most sense for you. In my home, I do 2x8 beds. So I have a lot of thin beds. And it takes the exact same amount of lumber to do two 2x8s as it does one 4x8. And it just makes sense for my yard, because I want to keep the profile of my garden small, because I'm dealing with some trees on one side. So that puts more of my garden in the sun. But for these purposes, a 4x8 bed.
Okay, so Anna asked, what if we don't have access to a greenhouse? And I think she was referencing the starting from seeds. I will say, Anna, we're going to have a whole class about seed starting coming up, but I'd like Josh to weigh in just a little bit too.
Yeah, so I'll let them go into the kind of nitty-gritty of seed starting. What I want to say is, with a little bit of proper planning and a very small budget, you can be very successful without a greenhouse. I've grown plants before I had access to large greenhouses in my basement with lighting. I will say the most successful indoor plants that don't have greenhouses, you really should, if you're going to do this, is invest in a good light for yourself, a good grow light. This is the only way that I see these things really beefy. Otherwise, if we're trying to start them in window seals, you get leggy plants that are very spindly, that lean one way. And you can certainly grow those, but those plants will survive. I really want to focus on plants that are thriving. In order to get these plants to thrive, you really need to start them off properly, which sunlight is your biggest hurdle. So I know now you can get really good LED lights for like $120. It'll last you 10 years. So I think that's a good investment. You'll certainly, if you're going to be a gardener, if you're having the alternative is starting your own seeds or buying starts, the light will pay for itself within a few years, depending on the size of your garden. But really, it's about proper temperature and proper moisture and proper lighting, and you can really easily achieve all three of those in any home setting.